Unfortunately, one of the things we do at Blue Frontier is have Google News feeds. One is, so we have the word ocean in our news feed. And for the last year, half the news reports on ocean are on Frank Ocean. So apparently if you're a Tony-winning popular pop singer who's come out of the closet and gotten into a fight in a parking lot with an abusive rapper, you're the news equivalent of 71% of the planet. The fact I even know that much about Frank Ocean is an indictment of the media as it exists today. And so hopefully we got some good tips out of the media session, and certainly Chris Palmer puts the fun in fundraising. People were wowed there. And I know that there was a lot of organizing in here for the for tomorrow's Hill Day. And I know a lot of people who weren't here who are going on the Hill. So people who are here who are state leaders, could you all hold up your hands or your notepads and people can see who you are? These are going to be the state leaders for tomorrow's Hill Day. We have over 100 meetings. And if you weren't in the planning meeting, we'll keep emphasizing this. I know that a lot of people started getting organized and a lot haven't yet. But obviously, our elected officials need to know that our public seas are maybe even marginally more important than Frank Ocean's career. So I think the next session is looking at, and one of the issues that we have as a movement, as a Blue movement, is communicating climate issues, creating value added in terms of communicating to the public how climate impacts our ocean, what it means to have a warmer, more acidic ocean that holds less dissolved oxygen, what it means to have climate impacts and extreme weather that mostly impacts our coastal zones, what it means to have an Arctic where the ice is melting and the response to melting ice as a result of fossil fuel-driven climate change is to look for new fossil fuel deposits. We need to find a strategy to communicate what climate means from the marine and coastal perspective, and that's what this panel is about, and I hope we get a lot out of it, and there'll be time to make it an open conversation. So I'd like to introduce Lisa Suatoni, who's a senior scientist with the NRDC, who's organized and moderated this panel, and she'll be able to introduce the folks to you.
I want to thank David for inviting me to moderate this panel. I find this topic fascinating. It occupies much of the work I do at NRDC, and I find the work of all the panelists really interesting. And I think this conversation is an important conversation for our community. Each of our panelists will discuss one perspective of what David entitled the panel, Making Climate a Blue Issue. Our first panelist will be Marea Hatziolos. Dr. Hatziolos is a senior coastal and marine scientist at the World Bank. And she specializes in coastal development and the impacts of climate change on coral reefs. We also have, and I'm going to go in order so the panelists know what order they're going in. Mike Tidwell is the founding director of the Chesapeake Climate Action Network, which is a grassroots organization, and it's dedicated to raising awareness of the impacts and solutions of climate change on Virginia, Maryland, and D.C. He is also an author and a filmmaker, and I'm sure you're well aware of some of the books like Ravaging the Tide. Gordon King is with us today. He's an aquaculturist. He's a division manager at Taylor Shellfish. He's in charge of their mussel production and also designed and put together and installed the Black Pearl culture program in Fiji that they have. And I spent much of lunch trying to figure out how to get an inexpensive black pearl from him. And then we have Lee Crockett, who is the director of U.S. Fisheries campaign for the Pew Charitable Trust. At Pew, Lee develops the campaigns to figure out how to stop overfishing, how to improve fisheries management and forage species, and also how to integrate ecosystem-based management into U.S. fisheries policy. Now, before we begin today, I just want to spend a few moments examining the the charge that David gave us. I thought the title of the panel was intriguing, and I spent a little bit of time thinking about what it meant to me and what it might mean to other people. It's making climate a blue issue. And for some, and I know this is true for Mike Tidwell in our panel, that means let's look to the oceans for solutions. Let's use the variety of ocean services that they provide, like renewable energy, wave, wind, and carbon storage, to help reduce the accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere. However, to others, the phrase may mean something completely different, which is let's take the growing concern about climate change and ocean acidification among ocean industries and ocean stakeholders and direct it to build political will in reducing CO2 emissions. Still, another interpretation is kind of the flip side of that, and let's take the growing concern and interest among ocean stakeholders and direct it towards improving ocean health and marine ecosystem resilience. And lastly, I know that some argue that because the oceans absorb 80% of the heat that's being trapped by our thickening atmosphere, and that it redistributes that heat around the globe, the global warming is really ocean warming, and that the oceans should be the focal point of climate science and climate policy and not a footnote. And so those are just kind of a variety of the perspectives that we'll see on the panel today. And I'm sure there are other perspectives that I haven't defined, but I'd like to have an open conversation about that when the panelists are over through Q&A. Now, before we begin, I'd just like to launch this panel by showing a film, a great little film by Jim Toomey on oceans and climate change, because I think it very succinctly gets at the variety of impacts that climate change brings to oceans. And if they have that queued up, I'll take it now.
Why all the fuss about climate change? Is it really happening? Is there anything we can do about it? Let's look at the facts. Scientists have noted a substantial warming trend over the past century. What gets confusing is that temperatures still go up and down, and sometimes it can get pretty cold. But the overall direction that the climate is heading is clearly hotter. The vast majority of climate scientists agree with very high confidence that human activities play a key role. The carbon dioxide and other gases we've been adding to the atmosphere are trapping too much of the sun's heat. That's why they're called greenhouse gases. So why all the fuss? Well, there are some scientists who just don't agree. That's okay, but think about this. If 9 out of 10 doctors told you that your child needed to go to the hospital, but one told you not to worry, what would you do? Recently, leaders around the world agreed that keeping a global temperature rise at or below 2 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels is crucial. If we don't, it could result in increasingly costly impacts and irreversible effects. Even now, sea levels are rising and wreaking havoc. Salt water in places like Florida may seep into the ground and contaminate drinking water. Some small island nations may vanish. More extreme weather events are occurring. Some areas, such as the Midwest, have experienced more intense droughts, while other areas have experienced increased heavy precipitation. Sources of fresh water are disappearing. Glaciers are melting. Many species will either have to adapt or go extinct. These trends will continue as the planet warms. So is there really anything we can do about it? The answer is yes. All across the globe, there are inspiring examples of people making a difference. Decision makers can adopt policies to promote energy efficiency and cleaner energy. Coastal communities can preserve habitat and help make our shorelines more resilient. As individuals, we can use less fossil fuel by taking public transport, driving more fuel-efficient cars, weatherproofing our homes, and reducing energy use. Besides, what's good for the environment is almost always good for our bank accounts. Together, we can make a difference.
Okay, now I'd like to invite Dr. Hatziolos.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thanks to all of you for coming this afternoon to hear this panel. I realize that the audience is largely a U.S. audience, and many of the issues that we are going to be discussing are directly relevant to us as a country, but I want to expand the scope a little bit to talk about some of the poor countries of the world, which are the clients that I work with, and to help all of us understand how our actions in the United States can also impact on other countries, particularly with respect to climate change. Just for starters, how many of you know what the World Bank is? Okay, well that's great. I'm delighted to hear that. Well, it will make my talk a little bit easier. Then you probably know that our mission is a world free of poverty. Now, recently, that mission has changed somewhat. We have a new president of the World Bank who is a physician by training and also an anthropologist. And he has spent most of his professional life working with very, very poor people, particularly on health and social aspects. And he thinks that it's unconscionable that more than 2 billion people live in poverty, 1 billion in extreme poverty who earn less than $1 a day, another 2 billion who earn less than $2 a day. This continuation of world poverty is unconscionable, and so we need to end extreme poverty. But he's also added something, a twist, which is also promoting shared prosperity. Because even as we see many countries move from abject poverty into transitioning economies, there's a lot of inequality that accompanies that. Some countries are doing very well nationally, but when you look at the distribution of assets, you see increasing inequality. So what we also want to do is make sure that we have shared prosperity, that everyone is benefiting from this development process and socioeconomic growth. So I've got a brochure if anyone's interested to learn a little bit more about the bank, and I'll leave it here. Let me start by saying that the bank has been involved with oceans for as long as I've been there, which is nearly 20 years. But only recently have we been able to put oceans front and center on the World Bank agenda. And last year at the Rio Plus 20 Summit in Rio de Janeiro, the World Bank, along with another 100-plus partners, launched the Global Partnership for Oceans. And that is a grand coalition of the willing and the able to start really doing something significant and at scale to bring healthy oceans back. It's catalyzing new investment for country-led actions to support ocean health. And the goal of the Global Partnership for Oceans is to promote healthy oceans and reduce poverty, because we see in the World Bank oceans as critical development resources. We see the untapped potential of the blue economy to really help bring prosperity to countries, to coastal communities, to the billions of people who actually rely on fish as their main source of protein, who rely on ecosystem services for jobs and livelihoods and even coastal protection. So we see an intimate relationship between ocean health and poverty reduction. Now, incorporated in those goals are several interrelated objectives which the Global Partnership of Oceans is trying to promote with all of these partners. The idea is that we ally and bring together parallel efforts so that they are focused on a few number of targets which the partnership would be held accountable for. One is increased fish production with sustainable fisheries and aquaculture. We know that captured fisheries have pretty much stagnated in terms of their growth potential. They haven't really moved from about 100 million tons a year or less in the last 10 years anyway. And most of the growth will come from aquaculture, but it has to be sustainable. And so we need to look at how we're going to increase productivity of the ocean for food security purposes. We also know that we need to protect critical coastal ecosystems, habitats, and biodiversity, because without those services that these critical ecosystems provide, we will not have provisioning services for fish. We will not have coastal protection. We will not have carbon sequestration or a generation of oxygen, all of the things on which life on this planet depends. And we need to reduce pollution, particularly now plastic pollution, which we're seeing as being very, very intractable. Huge issues with nutrient pollution in coastal areas and these large deoxygenated areas, but also we've got pollution from plastic, which is becoming particulate and embedding itself in the food chain and contaminating our very food stocks. And then there's climate change, which is a cross-cutting issue that runs across all of these objectives. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we see climate change influencing some of these services. And specifically, I would like to talk about tuna fish stocks, because I've just returned from a trip to the Pacific, and tuna is very much on everyone's mind. Who are the partners in the Global Partnership for Oceans? Well, there are 130 and counting. On the page, you can see that we're talking about not only intergovernmental organizations like the World Bank, but bilateral institutions like USAID and Australian Aid, New Zealand Aid, the private sector, Gorton's, Costco, foundations such as Moore, Packard, World Wildlife Fund, Conservation International, etc. So really, and then also research institutions, the University of Queensland being one of them I'm very familiar with. The idea is to as I said, create an alliance of different strategic partners who have much to offer in helping to rebuild the health of oceans and then work together towards these critical goals. So I said I was going to talk a little bit about tuna fish stocks because they're very important to many of the countries in the Pacific. In fact, they're the major earner of GNP and foreign exchange for many of the smallest countries in the Pacific. They have very, very small land masses, but huge exclusive economic zones just by virtue of the geography of the country. And as a result of that, they have a lot of potential to use those fish resources for economic development, but it requires partnerships and goodwill on the part of those countries wishing to fish in their exclusive economic zones, among which is the United States. So I'm going to play a little film.
Tuna still remain. More than 70%
lessons
of
for us to
world's
learn
fish
from these
is
ocean
caught in these
pioneers.
tropical waters.
Okay, sorry, that didn't work out very well. There was an echo and a delay effect. Basically what it says is that the Pacific Island countries and the Western Central Pacific region, which goes, say, from Japan or China all the way to Easter Island, is the source of the most healthy stocks of tuna in the world, and about 58% of the world's tuna comes from this particular area. About half of that is actually provided in the EEZs of these small island countries. So we're talking about a total production of about $3 billion, maybe 2.5 million tons per year. Now, of that amount, these Pacific Island countries, many of which are less than 100,000 people and with a landmass of just hundreds of square kilometers, are getting only 5% of that landed value. So about $170 million a year divided by 8 or 9 countries who are part of a I like to call it a tuna cartel. Most of the value is going to the partners or the distant water fishing fleets who have access agreements to fish in the waters of these countries. These small countries don't have the wherewithal to fish their tuna stocks because they're very small, limited population, limited resources. They don't have the fleets to go out and fish. So they depend very much on these access agreements with distant water fleets, who, because the price of tuna is going up and everyone wants tuna, are very, very eager to come and fish in the exclusive economic zones of these countries. Now, I've put a map up of the Pacific, Western Central Pacific region, and basically it's I don't have a pointer, it's hard to really show it. You see a lot of bubbles, and then you see little specks of land within the bubbles. Okay. There are 3 different colors of blue. There's a dark blue, and that represents the Melanesian countries, one of which is the Solomon Islands. Right here. You can see there's a little speck of land, the rest is water. So the bubbles are the exclusive economic zones, and in the center of those zones are the countries, the small islands. The medium blue represents the the Micronesian countries, and then the lighter blue at the bottom to the bottom right are the Polynesian countries. So those are the three main sort of groups of countries in the Western Central Pacific. Now, it turns out that tuna stocks, this area has four kinds of tuna, basically. It's skipjack tuna, which is what you get in a can and which has the highest value by volume. Then there's big eye, which is what you have usually as sushi, and that's under extreme pressure. Then there's albacore and yellowfin, both of which seem to be the stocks seem to be quite sustainable. But most of the skipjack tuna, which is fished in these very, very large purse-seine vessels, occurs across the equator. And so there are about 8 or 9 countries that have most of those tuna stocks. And they together have formed a cartel called the Parties to the Nauru Agreement. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. The skipjack fishery is more than half of the total tuna fishery in the region. And its value is about $2,100 per ton. There are about 30 tons per day taken out of this region. And so the first landed value of the fishery is about $3 billion, but these countries are only getting 5% of that value. Now, that's actually more than they were getting just 3 years ago. It's because they have formed together this group called the Parties to the Nauru Agreement, who are trying to increase the transparency of these access agreements and make sure that total allowable effort is consistent with sustainability. And that level of total allowable catch is determined scientifically, and it's meant to put a cap on the amount of tuna that's extracted. Now, tuna stocks are going to undergo climate change, just like every other organism on Earth. What we know is that the tuna are very sensitive to changes in temperature, to changes in oxygen level. They have very, very high metabolic rates, so changes in oxygen are going to affect their metabolism and their growth. It will also affect the food that they eat. And of course, the chemistry of the ocean will also affect them. They have otoliths in their ears, which are carbonate, and so they will be affected by acidification as well. I mean, all in all, we can expect there to be changes in the distribution and abundance of tuna stocks. Now, tuna also have the capacity to move. They're transboundary, which is what makes it so difficult to manage. They don't stay in one country's EEZ. So they can move around and go to the currents that are favorable for them. However, even at that, we expect shifts in the distribution. By and large, the model shows that the tuna will shift east. So that means the countries in the western part of that map are going to have fewer tuna stocks in the future. And most of the stocks will start moving from the Central Pacific to the east. So there are certain conservation measures that need to be put in place, including high seas marine protected areas in some of these pockets that are not claimed by EEZs. Now, this table just sort of shows you what the anticipated effects are in a qualitative sense from low to high for skipjack, which is in reasonably good shape at the moment, and it's managed under this Parties to the Nauru Agreement. And then big eye, which basically is not very well managed. It is taken as bycatch in a lot of the skipjack tuna fishery, and it's under extreme pressure, but that's the highest value tuna there is. That's the sushi grade tuna. And you can see that depending on the scenario, whether it's the B1 or the A2 scenario of climate change or CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, the impacts will increase over time. Now, you all know that we've now exceeded 400 parts per million of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. That was not predicted to happen until 2035 in both the B1 and the A2 scenario. So we've already exceeded that level in 2013. This is something to worry about. Now, the P&A Vessel Day scheme, as I said, was put into effect, I think, almost 20 years ago. But the mechanism that is so vitally important to protecting tuna stocks is this thing called the Vessel Day scheme, the VDS. And what it's done is created a scarcity. It has limited the number of access days or fishing days that countries can come and fish in the region. And so it's created a seller's market. So what that has done by creating a total allowable catch, which is then allocated proportionately to the different island countries, depending on their total EEZ area and stock assessments, has created a limited number of days, which these countries can then turn around and release out in access agreements. And it has raised the minimum vessel day price from $700 to $5,000 in about 3 years. This is a very, very impressive result of a collective action and the organization of these countries to negotiate and to have a more scientific basis for tuna fishing, and also a more transparent system. Now, what they need is a much more robust information system. They need better science to improve and refine that allocation, because as you can imagine, it's still a bit of an art rather than science to sort of determine how the 45,000 days of fishing effort, which is based on what an average purse seine vessel will fish, should be allocated among those 8 or 9 parties. And even though there's a formula, it's not perfect. And because of El Nino and climate change, we see stocks shifting. Sometimes they move east if there's an El Nino, sometimes they move west if there's a La Nina. And so the allocation among countries needs to shift with where those tuna stocks are. And the way the system works is that it allows for trading among the countries, sort of like a cap and trade. So if you're in Kiribati and the tuna shifts to the east where you are, and you only have 5,000 days, but you've got pressure to sell 6,000, you can then buy 1,000 days from one of the other members in the West at a lesser price, and then turn around and sell those days. But no country is allowed to sell more days than is allocated. Unfortunately, several countries have done that, and that is because of pressure from the district water fishing nations. So the point is that for this system to work, everybody has to be working collectively for the good of the tuna stocks. And we all have a stake in healthy tuna stocks, because the only healthy stocks are in the Pacific. The world has overfished the tuna everywhere else, and that's why we have fleets from the EU and the US and China and Korea and Taiwan fishing in these waters, because they're healthy stocks. And that is also why you're paying more for tuna, because it's getting very expensive. Okay, so let me just wrap it up by saying one of the conservation proposals that these P&A countries have made is to close certain areas of the high seas. And those are represented in these red circles. You'll see that there's sort of a white space. We call these the donut holes. That's the area that's not anyone's exclusive economic zone. That is a high sea area. And so normally these distant water fishing fleets can fish there for free. What the countries of the P&A have said is, no, we want those to be high seas MPAs. We need to preserve the stocks. They will become a fishing bank for us. Anybody who fishes in those areas cannot fish in our EEZs. Now, it seems to have worked as a result of this collective action by the P&A. However, there's a third donut hole, which is all the way to the east, and that is under contention by many countries, including the U.S. So, countries will act in their own national interest, but there's a higher sort of thing at stake here. And my point is that if this agreement is going to work, everybody needs to work together with it and to abide by the recommendations for conservation and climate change adaptation. Thanks very much.
Hi, my name is Mike Tidwell. As I was introduced earlier, I'm Executive Director of a group called the Chesapeake Climate Action Network. I hope some of you who live in the DC area may have heard of us. We're a grassroots nonprofit. We're all about climate solutions. And I want to thank everyone at the Blue Vision Summit for inviting me to be here, and to David for recruiting me. So I'm a full-time climate activist, and how do I make climate a blue issue? It's only a blue issue for me. Just 2 hours ago, before I left my office, a few metro stops from here, I sent out an email to my 90,000 members on my email list just today. And, the subject line of that email was, 400 is here, God help us. And when you open up the email, it was all about sea level rise from the 400 parts per million that people have been talking about throughout this whole summit. It is just staggering. In my region, it means that, we're if we continue in the 400 range of parts per million, downtown Baltimore is going to be under 60 feet of water. The White House itself will be flooded. All the naval facilities in Norfolk, Virginia will be devastated. So, to me, climate and the oceans are indistinguishable. And as a regional climate activist in Maryland, Virginia, and D.C., we talk about oceans all the time, and we try to get our members to understand how it's all interconnected. I mean, this is a water planet, and if you think about climate change, it's just a massive rearrangement of the world's hydrology, right? You warm up the oceans, you get thermal expansion, you get sea level rise, you warm the planet, the polar ice caps melt. That's a whole rearrangement from ice to liquid to gas. You heat up the continental interior areas. You have more evaporation, which means more drought. More moisture is in the atmosphere, so you have more extreme precipitation patterns. So for me, climate change is virtually only a blue issue, because if this is a blue planet and you're changing the climate of the whole planet, then by definition, climate change is a blue issue. And that's sort of how I see it. And that's how we talk about it in the region of Maryland, Virginia, and D.C. as we push for grassroots solutions. In my region, right here in the Mid-Atlantic, climate change is causing the Blackwater Wildlife Refuge on the eastern shore of Maryland. The Blackwater Wildlife Refuge is losing an acre of land every day. Every day, an acre of land is erased from this beautiful area, often called the Everglades of the North. Norfolk, there are people in Norfolk, Virginia, best kept climate secret in America. That city, that region of Hampton Roads is being overwhelmed by climate change right now. People park on different sides of the street in Norfolk based on the moon cycles now because of the sea level rise and the bigger tides. That's happening right now. And of course, acidification. Watermen in this region, the crabs are growing differently. The oysters are vulnerable to acidification, 30% higher acidification, huge issue that we're very conscious of in this region and talk about oceans all the time. So what's driving all of this? We know what's driving it, our combustion of oil, coal, natural gas. If we want to save the planet, we want to save this blue planet, then we have to stop torching, combusting, and exploding things to keep the lights on. We have to get off of fossil fuels. And to have any chance of doing that, we have to do it in a real hurry. The thing that I just wanted to talk about as a climate activist who's very blue conscious, how do we go forward? My organization's been around for 10 years. I founded it in 2002. And mostly we go after state-based legislation. It's hard to make things happen in Congress. We have to keep pushing in Congress. I've been involved in federal issues. I've gone to jail over the tar sands pipeline. I've handcuffed myself to the White House fence. I've done my part on the federal level. But mostly I work on state-based policy in Maryland, in Virginia, and the D.C. Council to switch off of carbon fuels and on to clean renewable energy like wind and solar. And the thing that I've learned as an organizer is that it's not easy to do those things. It's hard to campaign for clean renewable energy. The system, as we know, is stacked against us. But the rules are pretty straightforward. The strategy is pretty straightforward. It's not easy, but it's pretty simple. The rules are. And it's basically two steps. If you want to make change happen, whether it's to pass a solar bill in the District of Columbia or even to save the habitat for fisheries, basically to make change happen in human culture, you got to have two things. One, you got to build a big coalition. You have to build the biggest coalition you possibly can for your issue. Whether it's just a campus, make all new buildings green LEED certified, or it's saving, coral reef habitat. It's the same thing. Build a big coalition. The biggest coalition you can for your issue. That's number one. Number two is never, ever, 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 ever give up. That's been my experience of passing clean energy legislation in the Chesapeake region of Maryland, Virginia, and D.C. Those are the two steps. Now, the one thing that I have found is that building a big coalition and never giving up and making change happen is easier, and you tend to have better success in engaging people if you are opposed to something, if you're trying to stop something. If you're trying to stop a coal plant from being built, it's much easier to build a big coalition. Everybody wants to stop that. Tar sands pipeline is a great example. What an amazing coalition that we put together. Nebraska ranchers, indigenous people from the Dakotas, urban, environmentalists. It's just an amazing coalition, and we continue to fight really hard and have some success, and God willing, we're gonna stop that pipeline. And that's been my experience at the state level. Opposing things, easier to get people riled up and focused. But advancing solutions, proactively advancing solutions, much more difficult, much harder to inspire people to support legislation that will increase energy efficiency in buildings, much harder to inspire people to come together to get the best solar panel bill you can get. You could do it, and I have done it, but just much harder. But I will tell you, and this is my ocean story, after 2010 and the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico, I and many other Americans were so frustrated. What a ridiculous vision we have for offshore energy, that it's about drilling deeper and going further out, 5,000, 6,000, 8,000 feet of water under enormous pressure. Of course that disaster happened, and it's going to happen again if we continue to extract fossil fuels from our oceans under such challenging and dangerous conditions. So I was frustrated and just knew we needed, in the mid-Atlantic, in these ocean states of Maryland and Virginia, we needed a different vision for offshore energy. We needed one that was clean, not dirty. We don't want to drill for oil. We want level rise in ocean calamity through climate change. Can we pass a bill that would incentivize and make offshore wind power happen faster and safer? And so the amazing thing that I experienced in this campaign, we started it in the fall of 2010. We had our first legislative session in Annapolis in 2011. When we started this campaign with a press conference, we went to the governor of Maryland, we convinced him, we laid out the vision, we said this is big, he got it, he was very excited, very supportive, and then we rolled it out to the public. And something really amazing happened, is that I had never seen a solution campaign draw so many supporters. Our coalition was so big. Why? I mean, we had labor, we had health officials, we had the students, the campuses were really jazzed across Maryland in a way that I'd never seen for a solution-based campaign. And I think it's because people know climate change is a big issue. And if you come to them with small solutions, they think that either the problem isn't as big as you say, and therefore they shouldn't worry about it, or they say the problem is as big as you say, but you're asking me to support a small solution, which I know won't be enough. And what happens with the offshore wind campaign that we had in Maryland is people saw that it was a solution to the scale of the problem, because we had a vision. We said we're not going to stop in Maryland, but we're going to have an offshore wind vision from Cape Cod to Cape Hatteras to safely build dozens of wind farms that can actually power a third or a half of the East Coast. Imagine that, clean, renewable energy. And it was an amazing campaign, and we built the biggest coalition that I've ever seen for solutions, and it took us 3 years, because it ain't easy. And that tested the second step, never, ever, ever give up. And I will tell you that we passed the bill. Governor O'Malley signed the bill on April 9th of this year. This bill will incentivize 250 megawatts of offshore wind. Again, it was never seen as an isolated bill. This is something to get a whole industry started, to complement what's happening in Massachusetts, to do it in a bird-friendly way. I'm a lifelong birder. To do this in a responsible way, to make sure we maintain habitat, that we carefully move forward within the national ocean policy. but that we move forward and that we get off of CO2 and we don't turn to tar sands and offshore drilling like Deepwater Horizon. So that bill passed, and I just want to tell you, on the day that Governor Martin O'Malley signed it in Annapolis, he signed it in a building, in a room called the Governor's Reception Room. It's a 300-year-old room. It has paintings of George Washington. It's just an amazingly elegant room, and that's where the bills in Maryland are signed. The governor signs them, the president of the Senate is next to him, and the speaker of the House is next to him. And usually you have the governor sign the bill, and all the advocates that worked on a bill stand behind the governor. You know, he signs it. A photograph is taken by the official photographer. The governor pens are handed out. You guys know that routine. For the Maryland Offshore Wind Act of 2013, our coalition was so big that day for the signing that they had to take 3 photographs to get all the advocates in it. All the members of the American Lung Association, all the students who ducked their classes to come to Annapolis, who wanted to be part of that signing, the environmentalists, the labor people. And that's how we made it happen. And so, you know, making climate a blue issue, it's a blue issue for me, and I think the offshore wind industry is part of the blue solution. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, and thank you to Lisa and for inviting me here. I feel perhaps I've got a bit of a different focus to a lot of the people here. I think I have the same concerns. I've been farming shellfish for a bit over 30 years. And I work for a company in Washington State called Taylor Shellfish, and I've been farming shellfish for over 100 years. The Northwest oyster industry has been an industry since before statehood, and there's over 150 years. Started big time with the gold rush in California, and of course, even before that, Europeans were in the Northwest for thousands of years. Shellfish were a very important part of the culture and nutrition for the native tribes out there. The shellfish industry employs several thousand, over maybe 1,000, 2,000 people in total, and has an estimated economic impact of about $250 million. And additional to that, it provides a important environmental monitoring service, because without clean water, the shellfish industry ceases to exist. In the 40s and the 50s, they lobbied very hard to get many of the pulp mills closed down because it was destroying oyster sets in Puget Sound and other parts of the Northwest. Which brings us to ocean acidification. In 2006, it was noticed that in the shellfish hatcheries in the Northwest, and there's 3 main large ones in Oregon and Washington, that they were having problems with getting decent survival of shellfish larvae through to setting. Originally, they thought it was a vibrio called Vibrio tubiaceae, and they spent a lot of time finding out where that was coming from. Eventually, it became apparent that even when the vibrio wasn't there, they were still having issues with larval survival. It was then they started looking at the pH of the water that was coming into the hatchery, and they found that particularly in the hatchery in Oregon, called Whiskey Creek, partway down the Oregon coast on Netas Bay, that when they had periods, they were getting unusual deep water upwelling, which wasn't very common. And when they had periods of that upwelling, they got little to no survival of the oyster larvae. They looked at the pH of the water as it was extremely low. Led to further investigation, and in this slide here you can see in 2008 at Whiskey Creek they had a year that was so bad that they lost a lot of money and they considered closing the hatchery down. Down behind the chairs there's the Taylor hatchery, which the company I work for, and they had several very difficult years too. Not quite as bad as Whiskey Creek, but when they got some money from, they lobbied the federal legislators and they got $500,000 from, which was mostly due to Senator Marea Cantwell, which they're very thankful for, and they bought some monitoring equipment, and this hopefully, okay, I guess we'll do the other one. There we are. So they got, so each hatchery got a couple $100,000, and we'll get on to that. And they started looking at what was happening with the water that they were putting through the hatchery. Sue Cudd down at Whiskey Creek very soon realised that they measure acidity of the oceans in pH, which is actually quite a difficult thing to do with monitoring equipment. But it's much easier to measure the partial pressure of carbon dioxide dissolved in the water. And she realised that the water that they were pumping through the hatchery would vary from 200 to 300 parts per million of carbon dioxide at times to over 2,000. And once you get up over 700 or 800 or over 1,000, it's very difficult to get larvae to survive from hatching to set. And she found that it was very determinant on the time of the day that she filled her tanks with water, and also what was happening, ocean conditions and weather conditions offshore. The reason that it's a problem for the pH to be low is that juvenile shellfish start off as a swimming larvae, and they have to lay down shell, which is made of calcium carbonate. This slide here is a picture of oyster larvae, and the ones on the left were raised at our hatchery in Tidwell Bay in the Puget Sound. Actually, sorry, it's in Hood Canal, east of the Puget Sound. And it's the ones on the left were raised in water that had a higher pH and a lower PCO2 because it was from shallow water, and the ones the ones my left, right of the slide, and the ones on the far left were deep water, which had high PCO2 and low pH, a lower pH. And once we see these electron pictographs and saw these, we realised why it was impossible to get young shellfish from a spawn to a set, and without those juveniles, it was cutting down the supply of seed for the industry, which eventually would have broken the industry. So what we've done now is we've done a couple of things. One, by monitoring, we know when to fill at what time and from what parts of the water column to fill our hatcheries. And the other thing is we've started softening the water. We're injecting sodium carbonate into the water so that it raises the pH. But as you can imagine, it's still very concerning, and it's concerning because the water in the Pacific Ocean, the pH is still dropping, and what the oceanographers such as Richard Feely tell us is that the water that's upwelling now was last at the surface probably 40 to 50 years ago. So you've got a very slow conveyor bringing water from from the surface down deep and then back to the surface again. So even if you correct the problem with high CO2 in the atmosphere now, we're still going to get decreasing pH in that deep water as it comes back up for probably 30 to 50 years. And right now it's a problem for juvenile shellfish, but it may be, it'll get to a certain point where the pH is so low that it'll start corroding the shell of adult shellfish too. And the reason that they can't lay down the calcium carbonate is because they measure the calcium carbonate in the water, and it's called aragonite, and it has to be at least a saturation, say, which they give a measure of 1. And for shellfish, juvenile shellfish to grow successfully, it really needs to be 2 to 3 times saturation. So I would figure about 2 to 3. And once the pH gets too low and the PCO2 gets too high, it just doesn't happen. It's too much stress for juvenile oysters and other shellfish to be able to grow. That's figures. That's a comparison of the pH and at the 2 different intakes at our hatchery in Davon Bay, and as you can see, if we try and use the deep water, we're just not able to grow shellfish. It actually turns out that the deep water is very good for growing algae because it's high in CO2, and algae needs CO2 to grow. The last point of my like to talk to you guys about is it's be nice and easy to say that all the problems we're having in the shellfish industry are due to ocean acidification, but it's also water quality overall. And this is a slide from a company called PSI, and anyway, it shows during spring in the bottom of the Puget Sound we had a big bloom of diatoms, which are really good algae for shellfish to eat. The bloom crashed. This particular bay, Tidwell, was high in nutrients. The bloom crashed, and when the bloom crashed and died, the pH dropped and the PCO2 skyrocketed. Then what we had was a move from an ecology of marine water filled with diatoms to a marine water filled with dinoflagellates, which in this case turned out were not palatable to the mussels that I was growing. And by the end of October, I noticed that my mussels were dying, and when I looked at them, I found out they were starving to death. So that was very concerning to me. I thought, have we reached a point in the Puget Sound where the water quality is so bad that I need to be able to carry a crop of mussels through to harvest? But it's tied into acidification, but to say that that's purely due to acidification may be a stretch, because it's about 100 miles from the Pacific Ocean to the bottom of the Puget Sound where it's growing these mussels. But of course, it's very difficult to know when we change gross climatic and physical characteristics like temperature, CO2, and the acidity of the water, how that ends up affecting things further down the food chain and further into Puget Sound and overall weather conditions. And the last one. And this is just part of that same study that they did in the bottom of Puget Sound, and the graph at the bottom is actually a native oyster set, and they found that when the pH dropped and we got a rise in the numbers of the proportion of dinoflagellates compared to diatoms in the water column, that the native oyster larvae would not set. We got very few coming through to survival. So I guess my bottom line is I am concerned about what's happening in the ocean, but I'm not very hopeful that we'll fix it. So, thank you.
Good afternoon. As Lisa said, I'm Lee Crockett. I direct the Fisheries work at the Charitable Trust, and she gave me a little too much credit for what I do. I don't develop all the campaigns and all the strategies and all that. We're a pretty robust, large group that does that. So, and one of the things I want to talk about is fisheries and fishery conservation is a big part of what Pew and this environmental initiative does. And we constantly battle with trying to get people to care about fish and the ocean and what's going on underneath the ocean, because the vast majority of Americans just don't have a clue. Their experience with the ocean is at the beach, and it's so vast that they can't imagine if there's any problems. And so some of us have been doing fish, and there's a number of them in the room here, Sean Cosgrove and Chris Dorsett. We've been sort of looking at this issue of climate change and the impact of climate on the ocean as a way to garner more attention for the impact it's having on the ocean, and then what do we do about it, sort of adaptive management to address the impacts of climate on the ocean, and its fish in particular. And so what I want to talk about is just kind of briefly give a little bit of overview of some of the things that are affecting how increased CO2 in the atmosphere and in the ocean is affecting our ocean fish. And one of the primary things that's going on is we're starting to see a shift in distribution of fish species. As ocean water warms, we're seeing fish move from the equator up towards the pole and into deeper water. And that has implications for how we manage our fish. We're also seeing, and the last presentation talked a little bit about this, warmer water causes larvae to mature at different times and mature sooner. So the distribution of species where there are larvae in the water column and transport for great distances can be changed, reduced. Planktonic communities change, so because of the distribution of those communities change because of changes in currents. We have acidification, as we just saw, damaging calcifying organisms. And then the rebuilding of depleted fish populations could be delayed because of larval survival changes, and so we're not getting enough food for these larvae, and that's having an impact on rebuilding. And we're starting to see examples of these shifts in fish species. The surf clam fishery off the east coast of the United States has shifted northward. It used to be very vibrant off of Delaware and Maryland and Virginia, and it's almost non-existent there. There's been studies that have looked at the North Sea and found that 13 species have shifted kilometers north, and 6 species have shifted deeper. In fact, there's 5 Mediterranean species that are now the subject of fisheries in the North Sea because they've moved into these areas. So we have this movement of fish species that's because of climate change. And I was at a panel discussion that some colleagues of mine put on from the Island Institute, and they were talking about the Gulf of Maine and what's going on there. And they're seeing some really profound changes in things like southern species like triggerfish, which are found in the south part of this country and in the tropics. They're finding these in Maine and lobster traps. They have overwintering populations of the blue crab that we all know from here in Maryland are in Casco Bay, never before seen. We have lobsters as the main fishery in Maine now. The groundfish fishery, the cod stocks are pretty much decimated. And 80% of Maine's fishing comes from lobsters. And the lobsters are now molting a month and a half to 2 months earlier than they were before because the water temperatures are increasing in the Gulf of Maine. So it's really having an impact in that part of the country right now. And there's some suggestion that the cod stocks, this is the other groundfish, the flounders, they're at their southern distribution of their range. So what is the increased water temperature doing to them? We've just gone through some really painful cuts in New England where they've reduced the quotas there by 70, 60% because they did a new assessment, said the stocks were in really bad shape. All the politicians screamed, they did the assessment again, came up with the same conclusion. And so they've had to put these really significant cuts in place. What part of that is related to climate impacts and making the Gulf of Maine and Georgia Bank less hospitable to these fish species? Now, fishing can also exacerbate these climate impacts. Just the act of fishing, we're targeting the larger, faster growing segment of the population. So we're culling the big fish, the faster growing fish, and leaving smaller, slower growing fish. Because of the way we fish, we use large nets or long lines that kill far more than the target. Thousands and thousands of other fish and other wildlife are killed. So that's having an impact on ecosystem biodiversity. We deplete our populations from overfishing them, killing them faster than they can reproduce. And we're taking too many forage fish. And forage fish are the food fish that are sort of the bridge in the ecosystem from the phytoplankton and zooplankton, these microscopic plants and animals. These fish, like menhaden, herring, sardines, they eat that, and then they feed the larger ecosystem. So the big game fish, the marine mammals, the seabirds all depend on that. Yet we set the catch levels for those forage species without really considering how much we need to leave in the water to feed that larger ecosystem. So fisheries management today is mostly a single species management model. We figure out how much fishing an individual fish population can withstand, and that's how we set the catch levels. That is particularly a problem, as I said, with these forage species. You got to leave more of them in the water, and that has an impact on the ecosystem and ecosystem resilience. Also, and this is important, the climate is assumed to be static. When the modelers, the fisheries scientists do an assessment of the health of a population, they assume that things are static, and that, as we know, is changing, and that's not accurate. So they do things like figure out population productivity. How much fishing can a particular population stand? They figure out the carrying capacity. What's the target? What's the target population size we should have? They figure out the current population size relative to that target population. So all of that, very important parameters are done with this assumption that things are pretty much the same as they have been, which isn't true anymore. Also, one of the things that we like to do is put in protections for spawning areas, the areas that these fish reproduce. Those are based on historical evidence. And so as populations are moving because of climate changes, what does that do to those spawning protection areas and other marine protected areas that they might put in place? So we need to start developing some better response tools for these changes, so better adaptive management to these changes that are coming, or they're here and they're going to get worse. So we need to be monitoring better for the distributional changes. Right now we have great data sets, but we're not really looking for changes in the distribution of these animals. So we need to do that. We need to utilize something called management strategy evaluations. And this is a technique where we look at various scenarios and project out to the future and try to pick scenarios that are going to be better for managing as future conditions might dictate. We also need to, as I talked about before, when we do our stock assessments, we may need to look at a shorter period of time for that data to take into account that things are changing in the ocean. Now, there's some pretty big caveats with this, is that when you do that, you reduce, when you have a smaller data set, you reduce the precision of those estimates of productivity and how much fishing can take place. We've got to be careful there. We also have to be careful that some members of the fishing industry might take that and say, well, the population there's been a regime shift, which is one of their favorite terms, and so things have changed and you can't make us rebuild that particular population so high anymore. So there's a tension between a true change and a perceived change that maybe somebody in the fishing industry might identify for reasons of having higher quotas or less restrictive management. And then we need to prepare for emerging fisheries. As species move into new areas, our history of fishery management is, hey, there's new fish, let's go catch them. Let's fish first, and then the way management works is you go fish. When a problem appears, then they start managing, and we got to do a management plan. We got to figure out how to fix the problem. And so let's think about reversing that burden of proof. Let's change that fish first, ask questions later mentality and say, let's figure out what is going on with this particular critter, how much fishing, if any fishing, it can withstand first before you allow fishing. And that's a fundamental change in how we manage fish in the United States and how we manage fish pretty much anywhere in the world. We also need to manage our fisheries in a way that fosters ecosystem resilience. And how we do that is, first of all, we got to ensure that we're not overfishing. We're not killing fish faster than they can reproduce. We have to rebuild the depleted population. So this is just doing a better job of single species management. We also have to look at minimizing the collateral damage of fishing. So this is, again, as I mentioned before, the bycatch that some of these indiscriminate industrial scale fisheries impose on the ocean. We need to promote more sustainable selective fishing practices. We also have to be cognizant of damaging habitats, sensitive habitats, from bottom trawls, huge nets that are dragged across the bottom that sort of act like a road scraper and scrape up everything on the bottom. Those need to be moved out of sensitive habitats, spawning habitats. And we also, as I talked about, need to manage our forage species to make sure we have enough of them in the water to feed the larger ecosystem. And finally, we need to move towards ecosystem-based fishery management. And the first step of that is to develop fishery ecosystem plans. And these are plans that sort of try to identify what's going on in the ecosystem, sort of describe the ecosystem, the physical and biological interactions in that ecosystem, set ecosystem policy goals, and establish measurable indicators of ecosystem health so we can determine whether things are getting better, whether they're getting worse. This is very much a new management philosophy, and the information and the science to do this is still being developed, but we need to start moving that way. And one of the things I want to be clear about is we're not talking about ecosystem management, because the science of that and the ability to do that is limited. What we're talking about is ecosystem-based fisheries management. So we take our fisheries management decisions in a larger context. Think about what you're authorizing and the type of fishing you're authorizing with how's that going to impact the larger ecosystem and what's appropriate from that ecosystem model. And then the final thing we need to do is operationalize those ecosystem plans. We need to make sure that our management measures are actually consistent with those fishery ecosystem plans. So to reiterate what I started out from the beginning, we're trying to sort of, to use my phrase, use climate change to get out of the fish ghetto and be able to sort of make this a broader issue that more people care about, and more people, besides just people who go fishing and make a living on the water, the larger American public and the larger world public care about fish management from a global change concept. So, thank you.
Guys to ask questions. If the panelists will come up, have a drink of water. And we have microphones in the aisles, so you can come down. It's very organized.
Hi, Michael Stalker, OCR. This is for Gordon. I know that there's a lot of work being done looking at carbon sequestration, carrying capacity of restored wetlands and seagrasses and what have you. I'm wondering if you know anything about localized effects of that in terms of your farming practices, whether restoration of other carbon sequestration material, plant material, might actually help your local pH.
Well, it seems evident. There's a group based in Washington State called the Pacific Shellfish Institute, and they've had grant money, which was for the last two slides. I borrowed them from the PSI. And I think what we're seeing is that with, particularly in the Puget Sound, that the anthropological damage or effect on the water quality is probably pretty major. So it's hard to know if sequestration is, I would say, is not evidently helping the pH of the water, but the effects of upland development on the Puget Sound watershed has a very negative effect on the pH. There's a couple, Alan Trimble and his wife Jennifer Reesing from the School of Fisheries and the University of Washington, and they looked at stable isotopes in juvenile shellfish in different parts of Puget Sound and Willapa Bay, and the the bottom of the Puget Sound, they have found that just about 100% of the nutrients that the shellfish are using to consume when they grow is coming from upland sources that almost none of it is oceanic nitrogen or phosphorus. Whereas once you get further out, it's predominantly nitrogen and phosphorus that's come from oceanic sources. So I doubt that the sequestration is helping, but it's probably harming things less by. But yeah, so probably didn't answer your question.
That might be the Puget Sound area because of what the walkthrough was pretty big there. But how about some other? I mean, if you look at down, for example, in the Gulf, where there actually are fairly large wetland restoration projects going in places where they're adjacent to shellfish farming areas. That's something to use.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's all that thing about runoff too. I mean, the problem with sequestration, I mean, that's probably more larger scale that you're trying to decrease the increase of CO2. But, wetlands and stuff, by having wetlands, it stops things running straight off the land into the water. And so swamps and stuff decrease the amount of pollutants and stuff that end up in the bays, which our shellfish then eat. So all that kind of thing is very positive, and our company does a lot of time supporting donations of shellfish and education and stuff to schools about pollution. So yeah, that stuff is very important. But I feel like we're fighting a rearguard action personally. See, we're seeing we can lose more slowly. That's what I think we're doing.
Hi, my question is for Lee. I'm Susan. I'm a fisheries observer in the Northeast, so I'm definitely on the front lines and in the trenches of all this that is going on. And my confusion might just be a matter of semantics, but you said that something along the lines of fisheries ecosystem policy is different than ecosystem-based management. I don't know if I got that exactly right, but you said that it's different. Can you just explain that and why? To me, the words sound the same.
Good. Thank you for that question. Clarify it. What I said was we're advocating for ecosystem-based fishery management. So managing our fisheries with the larger ecosystem needs in mind. So taking those decisions with how they impact the larger ecosystem. What I said we want to avoid is ecosystem management. So trying to manage an ecosystem. So in your neck of the woods, fishermen talk about, well, there's a lot of seals on Cape Cod. There's more than we've ever seen. So maybe we ought to cull a few of those because they're eating all the ground fish, or there's too many dogfish, which are a little kind of shark, and they're eating all the cod larvae and juveniles, so maybe we should kill more of those. So that's what we want to get away from, is that sort of manipulating an ecosystem, because we really don't understand what we're doing. We don't have the tools to effectively do that, and just take our management decisions, fishery management decisions, with a larger focus on it. So hopefully that clarifies it.
Drew Martin, I'm with the Sierra Club. I have just a quick question for each panelist, so I'm going to go really quickly. On the first panelist, you talked about aquaculture being more and more, but it seems to me that my understanding is that aquaculture is very damaging to the environment. It has a lot of very negative side effects. The second gentleman, you talked about coming up with new ways to create energy, but the reality is that we're really not getting anybody to conserve and conservation because people haven't really drawn the connection that, hey, it's how I live my life that's causing the problem. Even if we create a lot of new energy sources, we aren't getting the message across to people to use less. And I think that is a message that we need to get, and there's a lot of simple things that can be done. People don't need to have all their lights on and all that. The third gentleman, you talked about acidification, and we know that 400 parts per million is about where we were 3 million years ago. I think that's what I saw recently. And the question I have for you is, well, what did the ocean look like back then? And if we have to go back to that period, how would it change? In other words, would there still be sustainable species, and would we lose all of those species that have shells? And for the last gentleman on fisheries management, I have a real concern about the fact that we're not promoting fishing reserves or no fish areas where fish can recover. So those are my questions for each of the panelists. Thank you.
I'll start. Thanks for the question. There are good ways and bad ways to do aquaculture, but we cannot get away from, I think, the basic writing on the wall that if we're going to increase fish production, it's going to have to come from farming the sea. Now, most of the problems have to do with either conversion ratios, being culturing species that are too high on the food chain, which require other protein, and from fish to actually convert that into, say, a grouper or some higher value sea bass or what have you. The other problem comes from effluents, from water quality issues that are associated with super densities of the fish in their containers or on the fish farms. And we actually know how to do aquaculture properly. We are using less fish protein for feed. We're creating processed feeds, extruded feeds that have a much higher fisheries conversion ratio, and you can even grow fish that are higher up on the trophic level with these prepared feeds, which will reduce the sort of carbon footprint, if you will, and the ecological footprint of having to fish other species to feed, these high-value species. Secondly, we are starting to come up with indicators of sustainability of aquaculture at the ecosystem level. It's not enough to sort of say, well, this farm, has good water quality, and so we can continue to, certify this particular enterprise. When in fact you've got stacks of these things along the coast that are building up some kind of a cumulative impact. So what we need to do is look at those impacts on a larger scale and come up with indicators that we can monitor and then ensure that stocking densities are appropriate, that siting is appropriate, that we do polyculture so that we use the seaweed to extract the nutrients that are coming out of the fish cages as effluent. So if you have an integrated system, and this is part of the ecosystem-based approach, you can culture even salmon sustainably, and you use extruded feed and you increase the conversion ratio. So there are ways to do it, we just need to promote those.
I'll just say I'm a vegetarian. And I'm a vegetarian not because I don't like to eat meat or fish. I'm a vegetarian because meat production is energy intensive and the oceans are being overfished. And I've done some hard things in my life. I've quit smoking. I've learned foreign languages. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in the middle of nowhere. I've done some hard things in my life. Giving up meat and fish is not even on the list of top 20 difficult things I've done in my life. So I would just appeal to everyone that that's one alternative, is to not eat fish and not eat meat as an example of a low carbon, less pressure on the ocean lifestyle. In terms of why promote wind power when we're not telling people to use less and have a smaller footprint, I do that too. I have a solarized house. I heat my home with organically fertilized corn kernels grown 40 miles from my house by a Mennonite farmer. I have a native plant garden. I'm obnoxiously green. I'm a vegetarian again. But ultimately what we need is a price on carbon. We need to make carbon expensive, and when we do that as a national policy, then wind farms will get built on their own. People will eat less meat and fish just because it will be more expensive because there's a lot of carbon in that food. People will conserve. It will change behavior. The markets will change behavior. And I think we're closer to getting a national price on carbon, either through a carbon tax or some sort of national cap and rebate. I think we're closer than we think. I think this 400 parts per million science fiction freak-out world that we now live in is going to spark a conversation among the other extreme weather events that we will continue to see. And I think we'll see the price on carbon that will drive all the behavior that we want to see.
Actually, I would have preferred to answer Maria's question. But, I'm not a geologist, but as I understand it, throughout the world's history, there's been massive variations in the composition of the air. At times there was a lot more oxygen in the air, at times there was a lot less oxygen, and the same with CO2. I also believe that there used to be a lot more species of oysters than there is now. So I assume that with the rising pHs